I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Sometimes it seems as if the healthcare system is designed for providers instead of patients. How can we change that? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
One of the country's leading experts on health and technology has written a new book called Rebel Health, a field guide to the patient-led revolution in medical care.
What are patients doing to take control of their data and find solutions to challenging health problems?
People all around the world are connecting online. Some are seekers looking for information. Networkers share contacts and up-to-the-minute research information. Others create solutions.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learn about the patient-led revolution in healthcare.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, taking aspirin at the earliest sign of a heart attack could save a surprising number of lives. Researchers writing in the Journal of the American Heart Association created a population simulation model using data from randomized controlled trials. They found that if people took a single aspirin tablet as soon as they began to experience chest pain, 13,000 lives could be saved annually. The investigators point out that this tactic is extraordinarily cost-effective, with a price tag of less than $4 per year of life saved. Many physicians worry that aspirin could increase the risk of bleeding, but these researchers conclude that benefits of reducing deaths post-heart attack outweighed the risk of bleeding deaths from aspirin 10 times over.
Tattoos have become a popular fashion statement. It's estimated that about 30% of American adults have tattoos. Scientists are only now beginning to study the health effects of long-term exposure to tattooing. The Swedish Research Council funded a large case-control study. It involved nearly 12,000 individuals. The investigators report that people with tattoos were 21% more likely to have malignant lymphoma. According to the analysis, the risk of lymphoma was higher within a few years of the first tattoo. Diffuse B-cell lymphoma showed the strongest association. According to these epidemiologists, the study does not establish causation. However, they note that it does underscore the importance of regulatory measures to control the chemical composition of tattoo ink.
A number of people have reported that they developed tinnitus after receiving a COVID vaccination. However, COVID-19 infections have also been associated with tinnitus, vertigo, and hearing loss. Researchers at the University of Arizona interviewed people who reported post-vaccination tinnitus. They also compared the reports to those that have been posted to the Vaccine Adverse Effect Reporting System, or VAERS. According to those reports, there may be 47 to 70 cases of tinnitus per million vaccinations. The scientists found that the onset was usually rapid. People with hearing loss were more likely to report tinnitus. Insomnia and hypertension were also correlated. Pre-existing conditions of diabetes and obesity, along with high blood pressure, appeared to be risk factors. Consequently, the authors suggest that metabolic syndrome is a risk factor. Most importantly, they conclude that COVID-19 vaccination increases the risk for tinnitus. The CDC does not yet acknowledge such a link. One of the co-authors of this study is a person who experienced tinnitus following vaccination and went looking for answers.
The hottest drugs in the pharmacy are called GLP-1 agonists. You know them by their brand names: Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, and Zepbound. They're effective against type 2 diabetes, and they help severely overweight people shed pounds. There are, however, some potentially serious adverse reactions involving the digestive tract. At a large medical conference called Digestive Disease Week, researchers reported that a higher chance of gastroparesis among patients on GLP-1 medications. This condition is also known as stomach paralysis because food moves through the stomach so much more slowly than normal. In one study, gastroparesis was 50% more common with such drugs. Another study reported an increased relative risk of 66%. Early clinical trials didn't detect this complication. While the absolute risk may be low, this reaction may be serious because it can complicate surgery, increasing the risk for aspiration pneumonia.
Flatulence, that is, the gas released by some intestinal bacteria, has a function. Researchers have discovered that certain bacteria actually produce hormones, specifically progesterone derivatives, from compounds in bile. But the key is that the hydrogen gas produced by neighboring bacteria stimulates the production of these compounds, especially allopregnanolone. This hormone is important in pregnancy. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Today we're talking about a revolution in healthcare. It's not being led by artificial intelligence, nor is it a new treatment or technology. This revolution is being led by patients all over the world. They're uniting to learn about their illnesses and forming support groups to educate themselves about new advances for hard-to-treat diseases. They're even joining research teams.
To learn more about this revolution, we turn to Susannah Fox. She served as Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she led an open data and innovation lab. Prior to that, she directed the health portfolio at the Pew Research Center's Internet Project. She's the author of Rebel Health, a field guide to the patient-led revolution in medical care.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Susannah Fox.
Thank you for having me.
Susannah, we are so excited about your new book. And I guess we have to, have a little full disclosure because we have known you for decades because we all met years ago thanks to a mutual friend, Dr. Tom Ferguson. He was founder of a journal called Medical Self-Care, and he was the inspiration for the participatory medicine movement. So, Susannah, you have extended Tom's vision with this new book, Rebel Health. Tell us, how did this movement get started, and how is it revolutionizing healthcare?
Well, as Tom gathered us and taught us, this radical health movement that we see today, that's powered very much by the internet, is stepping into a long American tradition of revolutionaries, people who were left out of the mainstream, who banded together to try and find solutions, invent tools, build ways to make their lives and other people's lives better. We saw it happening in the early 20th century with Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. We saw it happening in the 1960s with civil rights, women's rights, disability rights. And now today, we have the internet and people's ability to gather together online, step into their power as patients, survivors, and caregivers. And really, it's our opportunity in mainstream healthcare to learn from them.
Susannah Fox, tell us your story. How did you get interested in the idea of participatory medicine or Rebel Health?
I started out as a researcher looking at the social impact of the internet on American society. And healthcare was just one topic that was assigned to me. But after the very first report, I fell in love. I fell in love with it because I saw the potential of the democratization of access to information and data. I also fell in love with it because I saw the opportunity to lift up the voices of patients, survivors, and caregivers. My mentor, Tom Ferguson, advised me to go and, as he put it, hang out with the cowboys, artists, and hackers of healthcare. And so that's what I did. And it's my honor to bring forward all of the stories that have been shared with me over the years.
Susannah, your book, Rebel Health, has the intriguing subtitle, A Field Guide to the Patient-Led Revolution in Medical Care. So what I'd like to know is, what do you mean by patient-led revolution, and why is it so important?
I chose those words very carefully, so thank you for noting it. Patient-led is a term that has emerged as the front runner in recent years to differentiate between the usual way of doing business in healthcare and a new way. And that is the default setting in healthcare through hundreds of years has been, frankly, that it's been physician-centered. And it was often physicians who were seen as the customers for medical devices and drugs. And it was physicians who were in charge of electronic medical records. Physicians were the center. And then more recently, people have talked about patients being at the center, and people have talked about patient-centered healthcare. What I am interested in is shining a light on patient-led medical care. And that is when patients themselves are on the design team for a clinical trial, for example, or they themselves are coming up with new innovations in medical and assistive devices. It's only when we really share power with patients that we're going to see the kind of acceleration of innovation that we really need.
One of the metaphors that you shared with us a very long time ago was this idea of tree shakers and jelly makers. And I've used it so many times I've lost count, but now you have added a sort of a twist on that to seekers, networkers, solvers, and champions. Please describe these differences and why they're so critical.
Oh, thank you. Well, in writing the book, I looked back at 20 years of my fieldwork notes. I'd spent time in online patient communities of all kinds, and I started to notice some patterns. I noticed that when people get knocked down by a new diagnosis, or they find themselves dropped into the maze of the US healthcare system, they reacted to that in a few different ways. And what I noticed is that each way that people reacted solves a different kind of problem. And so that's why I wrote the book as a field guide. Seekers are people who are not getting answers to their questions. They go on the hunt and they do not give up. That really characterizes seekers. They don't give up. Networkers are the kinds of people who learn in community. They, whether it's online or offline, they join groups, they form groups, they pool resources. If they find something that works, they can't wait to share it. Solvers are people who, if they see something isn't working, for example, a medical device, they will actually take it apart and put it back together again. They are inventors of assistive devices. They're also people who can contribute to system change. They just naturally want to solve problems. The fourth group emerged as I was writing, and it was in my interviews with seekers, networkers, and solvers who all started to talk about what really was the breakthrough for them was in meeting someone who had access to mainstream resources like funding, regulatory guidance, access to manufacturing facilities, and they shared them with a patient-led or caregiver-led team. And I call those people champions. They recognize when a grassroots innovation is ready for the big time, and they help people scale those ideas. That characterizes champions.
Susannah, we're hoping that you'll be able to share stories with us throughout this interview. And the one we'd like to start with, some of our listeners may have already heard, because we have talked to e-patient Dave de Bronkart, about his story. But I think Some people may not have heard it, so perhaps you could summarize it for us and tell us what kinds of lessons we should all be learning from it.
Thank you. E-patient Dave is someone who was going along with his life, and like most people, didn't interact with healthcare unless he really needed to. And then a diagnosis of cancer. Cancer is something that really gets your attention when your doctor says those words. And Dave was very lucky to have a doctor who was very early on every technological innovation that's come through. His name is Dr. Danny Sands. And he handed Dave not only information about his diagnosis, but handed him essentially a prescription for the Association of Cancer Online Resources, ACOR. That was a community of people living with cancer. They were patients, survivors, and caregivers who, again, felt left out by mainstream healthcare, realized that they knew things that clinicians and scientists do not. And so they started to band together using email listserv technology. This is back in the 90s. And Dave started using this ACOR listserv group to start to become a networker. And he gained so much value from the group that he transformed his life and he became an activist. He became someone who advocates internationally for patient data rights and the right of people to have access to all the information that they need. And that happened because a savvy clinician, Dr. Sands, handed him that prescription and he was transformed into being a networker.
Susannah, e-patient Dave not only became an international spokesperson, but he's still alive. And he's still in great health because his group helped him find the right path for what could have been a fatal disease. He could have died within 6 months. And instead, he's flourishing. And a lot of people have benefited both from ACOR and e-patient Dave's experience.
Absolutely true. E-patient Dave is a poster boy for the patient-led revolution. He represents exactly what we all hope for, and that is to connect to the just-in-time someone like me who can guide our path, who can help us make that great treatment choice and get access to the treatment that can save our lives.
You're listening to Susannah Fox, author of Rebel Health, a field guide to the patient-led revolution in medical care.
After the break, we'll learn how Dana Lewis was able to get her glucose monitor to sound an alarm loud enough to wake her.
What are the biggest challenges in patient-led research?
Can patient-derived data compete with RCTs?
A patient with Marfan syndrome invented a device to keep his weakened aorta from rupturing.
How can patient-led research projects get the credibility they deserve from healthcare providers?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is made possible in part by CocoVia, backed by 20 years of scientific research and the maker of the most proven and concentrated flavanol extract in the market today, Coco Pro Cocoa Extract. Cocoa flavanols are among the most studied plant-based bioactives today and are clinically proven to promote cardiovascular and brain health for the long term, supporting a strong heart and better memory.
Get 15% off your order of any CocoVia product by using the discount code PPOD15. Learn more at CocoVia, and remember that discount code is PPOD15.
These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Memory Plus is formulated with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, a level clinically proven to improve 3 different types of memory and support brain function. More information at cocovia.com.
Patients often feel powerless when faced with a new diagnosis or a condition that's hard to treat. Clinician researchers may not appreciate the challenges of living with a chronic condition that has no easy fix.
That's why today's patients are banding together online to provide support, encouragement, and research into ways to solve the problems they face. There are some huge challenges, though. Getting access to data from medical devices, obtaining funding for research, and receiving respect from health professionals has not been easy.
Are you a tree shaker or a jelly maker? Or are you a seeker who goes looking for health information when faced with a challenging diagnosis? Networkers like Susannah Fox help people spread information to those who need it.
Susannah Fox is author of Rebel Health, a field guide to the patient-led revolution in medical care. She served as Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she led an open data and innovation lab. Prior to that, she was the entrepreneur in residence at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and directed the health portfolio at the Pew Research Center's Internet Project. In every position, she helps people navigate health and technology.
Susannah, you tell another story in your book about Dana Lewis, and it may seem kind of mundane, but wow, what a difference. Please share it.
Dana was living alone in Seattle, and she lives with type 1 diabetes or insulin-requiring diabetes. And she's lucky enough to have a continuous glucose monitor, which helps her understand where her blood sugar levels are. There's a syndrome when you live with insulin-requiring diabetes called dead-in-bed syndrome, that if your blood sugar goes low in the middle of the night, you don't wake up. The problem is that Dana is a very deep sleeper, and the alarm on her continuous glucose monitor was not loud enough. She wrote to medical device companies asking for them to make that alarm louder, and they said, no, it's loud enough. But it wasn't loud enough for Dana. She is a networker, so she was constantly monitoring online discussion groups about diabetes and noticed one day that a dad named John Kostick had been able to essentially hack into his son's continuous glucose monitor, free the data, and send it to his Apple Watch. This was revolutionary, as you can imagine. And Dana learned quickly how to do it and was able to build her own louder alarm system.
So she no longer has to worry that she will be dead in bed.
Exactly. And that touched off a cascade of innovation in diabetes, because in the past, medical device companies had not seen patients as the customer. They had seen doctors who do the prescribing as their customer. They didn't want to listen to the patients like Dana, who were writing to them and saying, hey, we have ideas for how this could be improved. So patients, again, feeling left out of the mainstream conversation, gathered together to have their own conversation about how to improve their medical devices. And thanks to people like Dana, who are networkers, people like John Kostick, they stepped into their power as solvers, people who are able to create what they need. And I love their hashtag. They use a hashtag on social media that is, "We are not waiting." We are not waiting for the industry or the government or anyone else to do this for us. We are leading the charge and creating what we need.
There's another pretty large group of patients who are not waiting, and that is the people with long COVID. There was not too long ago a big story in Science News in which you are quoted, and it describes the patient-led research that some of these patients have banded together to help them live better. Can you tell us about it, please?
This story is one that I love because people living with long COVID broke the land speed record for recognition. And they were people who, in March of 2020, unfortunately, were part of the first wave who got the COVID-19 virus and did not recover within the 2 weeks that medical authorities said they would. So around April 2020, they started gathering together online and realized that they were among the forefront of patients who are going to be dealing with post-viral illness. They named it, patients themselves named it long COVID, and they fielded an international survey to gather together the symptoms and the trajectory of this new and emerging illness. They used off-the-shelf technology. They used Slack and Google Docs. And when they published their data, all of a sudden they had the world's attention. They were able to brief people at the CDC, the National Institutes of Health. In the UK, they briefed Parliament and, of course, the World Health Organization. And what it shows is that patients themselves have observations and can collect data that matters. And it is our opportunity to learn from people like the Patient-Led Research Collaborative for Long COVID, who conducted the survey, and to learn their techniques. And they are, again, the forefront of what I hope is one of the outcomes of the pandemic, and that is recognizing that personal science is as important as any other form of science when it comes to a fast-moving situation.
Well, this patient-led research collaborative for long COVID actually published its findings in a medical journal, which is unusual. And I'm wondering if you can just, and I think this is the one that people cite when they say there are 200 or over 200 different symptoms of long COVID that various people may experience in different combinations. Can you tell us, please, what are the biggest challenges that face patient-led research?
One of the biggest challenges is having access to the kind of forms and attention that the long COVID patients were able to garner. They did not let a crisis go to waste. Once they had the attention of these world leaders, they were able to leverage that into getting the attention of medical journal editors. And it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary times, and it called for extraordinary new measures. But most patients are not able to get that kind of attention so quickly. And the advice that other networkers and solvers have given is to say, start small. If you need to, create a poster, pitch a poster to a medical or scientific conference, and in that way start to build your credibility. In the case of long COVID, they were able to build their credibility by being the single source of data on this emerging phenomenon. And I want to say in that way, they actually were following the playbook of the people in the 1980s and early 90s who were revolutionizing the kind of science that we were doing around HIV. Here I'm talking about the group ACT UP.
Right. Now, Susannah, I have to tell you that as excited as we are about participatory medicine and about rebel health, it seems like it has in general, maybe not so much in long COVID, but in general, been a challenge to get healthcare professionals and researchers on board because a lot of these folks dismiss the patient experience as quote unquote unscientific or anecdotal. And for them, the only meaningful data comes from randomized, controlled trials, RCTs. How do you respond to that?
I would say that we need to look to the rare disease community for guidance. This is a community that often is building new tools and creating science on the frontier with very small numbers of people. And yet we learn so much from those studies. I would also say that there is a lot of work that's being done in the pursuit of health and well-being that is outside of any clinical trial. People are engaging in personal science experimentation all the time. When you think about how people are tracking their weight, diet, or exercise routine, when you think about people who are trying to figure out if they are intolerant to gluten or are dealing with some other food allergy, there is so much that we can learn if we empower people with the tools that they need to start tracking their data. And there's a lot of science that I think citizens are ready to contribute to. And yes, I also believe that if we're talking about the approval of a drug, the FDA is going to require RCTs. But for so much of life and so much of health, it really is between you and yourself or you and your family. And that's why I'm an advocate for empowering people with data, information, and tools to help them solve their own problems.
Susannah, you mentioned the rare disease community, and you have a great newsletter. Wow, how? Uh, health. In your newsletter, not too long ago, you described an individual named Tal Goldsworthy who has Marfan syndrome. That's a rare condition. Can you tell us what kind of a problem he was faced with and what he did about it?
I love this story. Tal Goldsworthy lives with Marfan syndrome, which means that he's very tall. The most remarkable thing that somebody might notice about someone with Marfan is that they have very long bones and they're also very flexible. But what you can't see is that there is a significant problem with their aortic valve, part of their heart that pumps blood. And that part, basically, it's a pipe in your body that can bulge and expand. And after too many years of stress in that way, it will burst. And the standard of treatment is a very invasive surgery that requires a heart-lung bypass machine and lowering your body's temperature and lifelong drugs. And Tal Goldsworthy, who is an engineer, he specializes in boilers, looked at this and said, now, hold on, this looks like a plumbing problem. And if I were facing this in my job, I would actually just wrap something around that pipe that's about to burst. Why can't we do that here? And so he invented the device that saved his own life. And it does essentially exactly that. They're custom made, 3D printed, and they wrap around that aortic valve to support it. And they were able to install it not only in Tal Goldsworthy, he was the first patient to try his own device, but they recently were able to implant the 1000th version of this.
Oh, my.
And it has revolutionized the way that Marfan patients are dealing with this life-threatening aspect of their health.
So it still requires some surgery, but it's not nearly as invasive as the previous standard. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Are there lessons learned from Tal's story that we can take beyond Marfan syndrome? But I mean, this is already pretty amazing.
It is amazing. What I would say is that we need to look at his story and recognize that everyone has something to learn and everyone has something to teach. We need in healthcare to think about the skills and tools and observations that people outside of healthcare might be able to bring to a problem. And patients who are living with a condition often say that they have an honorary PhD in that condition. The same is true of parents of kids with rare disease. You'll never meet anybody who knows as much as a parent of a child with a rare disease, maybe except for the top 3 experts in that disease in the scientific world.
Exactly. Well, they have the incentive to learn so much. I'm wondering, is there a way that patient-led research projects can get the credibility that they need with healthcare providers, as well as the funding?
The first thing that I would say is if you are part of a patient-led team that has a hypothesis that you want to test, the first thing to do is to do your homework. Do a complete literature review. And if you don't have anybody on your team who is a seeker, recruit somebody and go to a medical library. Librarians are incredible resources. Make sure you know all of the research that's been done already to be sure that you're not going to try and recreate something that's been done. The second thing that I would do is start to attend scientific and medical conferences. Another frankly, good thing that the pandemic has brought to us is the possibility of dropping in by Zoom to these medical and scientific conferences and making sure that you learn as much as you can from the people in the field. But never lose sight of the creativity that you bring. Never lose sight of the outsider ideas that a patient or a survivor or a caregiver can bring to a question. The last thing I'll say is that it's always a stronger position to ask questions of people in authority rather than to lead with a statement. Patients and survivors and caregivers I interviewed said that they would often find a way into a conversation by asking questions, that it's actually less threatening when you come in with a really smart question.
That sounds like really good advice. You're listening to Susannah Fox, who helps people navigate health and technology. She served as Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she led an Open Data and Innovation Lab. Prior to that, she was the Entrepreneur in Residence at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and she directed the health portfolio at the Pew Research Center's Internet Project. Her website is SusannahFox.com. That's SUSANNAHFOX.com.
After the break, we'll find out how patient-led research projects gain credibility and traction with healthcare providers.
We'll also learn about astroturfing. What does that mean? How can we detect astroturfing?
Data privacy online is an important issue. Getting access to your own data can also be a challenge.
A patient alliance can push for change from the outside, but patients also need collaborators on the inside of institutions to help them. How do you recruit them?
And how could you get involved with patient-led research?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by the People's Pharmacy and our exclusive line of magnesium-rich roll-on deodorants, crafted with years of expertise and community feedback. Our customers rave about their ability to control odor effectively without aluminum. These deodorants are a superior choice for daily health and comfort.
Each is designed to be gentle yet highly effective, providing reliable odor control without aluminum or other harsh chemicals. Plus, they're incredibly easy to use and long-lasting.
As a special offer for our podcast listeners, enjoy an exclusive 20% discount on any size of our deodorant. Choose between the handy 2-ounce scented or unscented varieties or the economical 3.38-ounce unscented version.
Simply visit the body care section in the store at peoplespharmacy.com and enter the promo code POD20, that's POD20, during checkout to redeem your discount. Remember, this promo code POD20 gives you 20% off your purchase of our top-rated magnesium-rich, aluminum-free roll-on deodorants until August 2024.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Memory and Focus is a unique formula made with a special blend of ingredients that work together to promote attention and support long-term memory. It supports 5 areas of brain performance in one capsule. More information at cocovia.com.
Now that most doctors, clinics, and hospitals rely on electronic health records, patients have access to test results and messages from the healthcare team, but participants in clinical trials are locked out of their data. And patients with pacemakers, implanted defibrillators, and other high-tech devices also have limited, if any, access to the data these devices generate. How can people take back control over critical information about their own bodies?
We're talking with Susannah Fox, author of Rebel Health, a field guide to the patient-led revolution in medical care. She served as Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she led an open data and innovation lab. Prior to that, she was the entrepreneur in residence at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and directed the health portfolio at the Pew Research Center's Internet Project. She helps people navigate health and technology.
Susannah, I'm wondering how patient-led research projects can gain credibility and traction with healthcare providers. And the reason I phrase it in that way is, frequently people come to us with home remedies. And they say, oh man, if you just put some black pepper on a kitchen cut, it'll stop bleeding in 30 seconds. And a lot of doctors go, oh, that's nonsense. How stupid. And yet, when we tried it, it worked. And there are literally hundreds of these approaches. And we don't have any randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials to say, oh yeah, it works. But it's sort of like, well, we don't have those for parachutes. But we accept the idea of parachutes without double-blind controlled trials. So I'm wondering how we can get patient-led research into the mainstream of medicine.
I think that one of the challenges that you are pointing out is when people have solved a problem, but it's still not visible to mainstream healthcare. And it is traded by word of mouth, it's traded on social media, and it therefore isn't reaching everybody that it could benefit. And that describes a home remedy like the one you describe, that also describes the invention of assistive devices that actually could help anybody with, for example, dexterity issues, but it's actually only being traded peer-to-peer among a small group of people. What I would recommend is that networkers get recruited into this conversation. If something really, really works for your community, whether you're living with a disability or whether you have an idea for a treatment that really, really works, you need to bring networkers into the conversation who can elevate it in the public conversation. You also need to find champions. And a champion can be, for example, a scientist who says, okay, I'm game. I'll test this in my lab and see if it really works. Or it could be an incubator who looks at a patient-led team and says, actually, I see a startup possibility here. And they can wrap a business idea around something and in that way bring it into the mainstream.
Susannah, we've been talking about how important it is for patients to connect and the importance of online patient communities. But I would like to ask you about a phenomenon that worries Joe and me. Um, you call it astroturfing, and I'm wondering if you can tell us what it is. How common is it?
This is when a patient group is set up by a business interest and they pay people to be involved. And it could be, for example, a pharmaceutical company that has a certain drug that they want it to appear to Congress, to regulators, to the public, that there are lots and lots of patients who are hopeful about this drug, who say that it works for them. And instead of it being truly grassroots, it is astroturf. It is something that's set up by business interests. And this does happen. And it's an unfortunate consequence of the power of peer-to-peer healthcare that we now see that people are able to gather together and have a stronger voice as a group instead of just as single patients or survivors. And we really need to watch out for it. We need to make sure that before you join a group or before, if you're a journalist, before you cite a group or quote them in a story, you need to look at, how did this group get started? Who's behind the funding for this group? And if you can't get answers, just be really careful about either joining it or giving them the spotlight.
Well, I really appreciate that, Susannah, because many years ago I was invited to participate in what I thought was a patient-sponsored, patient-dominated group on asthma. And I was particularly concerned about a class of asthma drugs that might have had some toxicity. And then later I discovered, oh, this is actually being sponsored. There's a lot of money that's coming from the pharmaceutical industry that wasn't particularly interested in adverse reaction problems. So I learned very quickly and got out of that group really fast because I thought, wow, I didn't have a name for it like astroturfing, but I knew I did not belong part of it. And I think sometimes patients are, shall we say, used by business groups like the pharmaceutical industry. How can we be alert for that? How can we protect ourselves?
Well, as patients, we need to be alert to it because, again, it may feel like it's a chance for you to raise your voice. And it can be very flattering to be asked to be part of a group like that as a patient, a survivor, a caregiver. And if you are an expert, if you are someone who's going to be invited to come in and speak, or if you're going to be asked to highlight one of these groups, again, you just need to be on your guard. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be ever easier for people to set up astroturf groups, especially in the age of artificial intelligence, where people can create a persona and create a fake profile quite easily. That's something that I'm really worried about. And I'm worried about the diluting effect that that can have on the patient-led revolution.
We're worried about that too. And another thing that a lot of people are worried about is their data privacy online. It's been a problem, but for a lot of patients, just getting access to their own data has been a challenge. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about that, why it's important, what people are doing about it.
And Hugo Campos.
Yes, so there's all kinds of data in healthcare that people should have access to. So I truly believe in open science, open data. I believe that everyone should have full access to their medical record, to open notes. And I also believe that people should have access to the data that is generated by their medical devices. So we heard about the diabetes story where it was essentially a dad who was able to hack into his son's medical device. But diabetes stands alone as an example of a group of people who are able to get full and open access to their medical device data. We also, thanks to 21st Century Cures, thanks to a bipartisan movement in the United States to make sure that people have access to their electronic medical record data, and they can take it from one hospital to another. They can direct it where it needs to go. This is a boon. However, there are examples where people have not been able to get access to data. And Hugo Campos is one of those people. He lives with a heart condition that requires essentially a pacemaker, an ICD. And he realized that he was having a heart flutter called AFib when he was drinking whiskey. And he likes whiskey, but he didn't want to go into AFib if he didn't need to. And so he asked the medical device company if he could have direct access to the data. He knew that his doctor had access, but frankly, nobody at the doctor's office was monitoring Hugo's heart data, especially not in the evening when he maybe wanted to have a cocktail. And both the doctor and the medical device company said, no, you can't have access. And so Hugo went to school. He attended a class, a whole course. He went from where he lives in San Francisco to South Carolina to learn how to program his own pacemaker. And he practiced and figured out how to service his own medical device in order to get access to the data. And he found out what foods and what cocktails send him into AFib. And one would argue that this is actually a good thing for the healthcare system. It's a good thing for Hugo's family. It's a good thing for Hugo's health insurance company, for him to have all the information that he needs to take good care of himself. And yet he stands alone as someone who has been able to, again, be a rebel and break in and get that data. The whole rest of the world who lives with this implantable cardiac monitor is not able to get access to that data. And I think that's a shame.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And just to be a little personal for a moment, I participated in a clinical trial several years ago, and I wanted to have access to the data. I asked the person who was running the clinical trial if I could see it. And she said, "Oh, no. That data is private. You can't see the data." But she was very nice. She told me what the data was. She sort of informed me offline. But it was like, wow, wait a minute. I'm volunteering for this clinical trial. Why shouldn't I see my data? The answer is, nah, it's not yours. How do we change that?
We change it by throwing a spotlight on it. We change it by gathering evidence for why it's important for everyone to have access to the data and information they need to take care of themselves. We need everyone to understand the detriment of not having access. And we need everyone to understand the benefit of having access, that it actually it's very American to have access to the tools and information we need. We are rugged individualists. We should have access to this. And it's just, access is unevenly distributed across the healthcare landscape. And what we need to do is keep drawing attention to areas where we don't have access and keep agitating to make sure that people understand what's at stake.
Well, Susannah, in your takeaways for the chapter on data, I love the takeaways boxes, by the way. You point out that the Rebel Alliance can push for change from the outside, but patients also need insiders to collaborate with them. How did they find them?
I love this story because what the secret is that there are people who are working inside mainstream institutions who are also rebels, who also are tired of the status quo, are tired of this situation where patients, survivors, and caregivers are kept out of conversations that could really help the healthcare system heal itself. And in the case of diabetes, what happened is that people at the FDA heard about these patients who had hacked into their continuous glucose monitors and asked to have a meeting with them. And as you can imagine, everyone was a little nervous on all sides, but the patients put up a pretty good case where they said, um, it's really dangerous? Living with diabetes. You know what makes it better? Having access to our data. And the FDA looked at it and said, well, they're not selling anything, which is a key point, as you know. And they said, let's monitor this and let's make sure that you are using medically approved algorithms and make sure you're staying within the bounds of safety. And they said to the medical device companies, hey, we're not standing in the way of this. Let the patients help.
Susannah, Tom Ferguson realized early on that being able to connect online was going to make a huge difference for patients. But it wasn't the beginning of peer-to-peer efforts to improve health. I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of historical background.
Thank you. I loved looking into this history of radical health movements in the United States because it helped me to see that when patients and caregivers are agitating for change, they are stepping into a long American tradition. I found that there was an example in almost every decade of the 20th century of people who were ignored or discriminated against. For example, in the 1930s, Alcoholics Anonymous was started because there really was not a good way to deal with substance use disorder. And that is a peer led response that is still well regarded today. Um, Bringing it forward into the 1950s, that saw the emergence of La Leche League for people who wanted to breastfeed, and it really wasn't supported by clinicians at that time. And it was mothers banding together peer to peer to trade tips. Our Bodies Ourselves came out of the Boston Women's Health Collective. And that was this powerful, radical idea that women should know their own bodies and how they work. This was really, really radical in the late 60s and early 70s. And I end that timeline with ACT UP and the HIV/AIDS movement, because that was the beginning of people starting to use the internet and starting to use technology. And what technology has done is remove the barriers of time and space and made it easy for anyone to connect with a peer patient, survivor, or caregiver.
And that's especially helpful for people who may have a, if not rare, unusual condition. You might not find somebody with Marfan syndrome on the next block in your town, but you can find that person online.
Absolutely. N of one is how a lot of people will describe someone living with a rare disease. They feel like they're the only one in the world. But thanks to the internet, you can often find other people. And even the National Institutes of Health recommend that people in their undiagnosed disease network use the internet, use social media to try and find other people like them.
Well, let me tell you about someone you may not know, Dr. Feigenbaum, David Feigenbaum, from Raleigh, North Carolina, in our backyard. He had a very rare condition called Castleman's disease. And Dr. Feigenbaum, he was a medical student at the time, was near death. And the doctors didn't know what he had, and they didn't know what to do about it. But he, together with another physician, were able to figure out he did indeed have Castleman's disease. And they figured out, I won't necessarily call it a cure, but a treatment that saved his life. And now he is spearheading a whole program out of University of Pennsylvania to deal with not just Castleman's disease, but other rare conditions, and also repurposing old drugs, drugs that have been around for decades. They're relatively inexpensive and can sometimes be repurposed to solve new problems. So Dr. Fagenbaum is also a poster child for a lot of what you're talking about.
He sure is. And I'm happy to say that I do know him. He was kind enough to send me a review copy of his amazing book. And I loved reading it and think that it is a great example of how someone who gets dropped into a dark corner of the healthcare maze uses his own skill set, uses his network to fight his way out and to bring everybody like him along. And it's so cool how he is leveraging patient insights to track the possibility of the repurposing of drugs.
Susannah, I'd like to talk about access to information because I remember a day when people couldn't get into a medical library. I mean, you had to be a doctor or a medical student or some other healthcare professional to be able to have access. Nowadays, everybody can get to what's called PubMed, the National Library of Medicine, online, free, fabulous resource, the world's collected medical literature. And in many cases, they can get full text. Most of it is just abstracts, but there are still now, access to the full article. Tell us why PubMed is such an important resource for people all over the world.
PubMed is an example of the democratization of health information. It used to be that you had to visit a physical library and ask permission, essentially, to have access to a medical journal article. It was also you had to hope that the library had that journal article and that they would allow you to photocopy it so that you could read it. And so the explosion of access that the internet has given us to all kinds of information, I'm happy to say the visionary librarians at the National Library of Medicine foresaw the importance of citizen access, not only clinician access to its archives and all of the journals going forward, and they created it. What I love is when they first had the concept of what would be PubMed back in the 90s. Did you know that the first name that they came up with was Grateful Med, as in Grateful Dead?
I
That's
do
so cool.
remember that. Yes.
Yes. But here's a problem, Susannah. There are a lot of clinicians who were trained in the sort of old days when doctors were the only ones who had access to this kind of information. And so when a patient comes into a doctor's office or a PA's office or a nurse practitioner's office, any clinician with paper that they may have printed off of PubMed, off of the internet, the doctor's hackles go up. There's sort of a defensive reaction. Oh, no, not again. I don't have time. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to listen to it. How do we break down those barriers?
I think that we all need to have respect for each other. I think that's at the base of this. The patient coming in needs to have respect for the doctor's training and expertise, and they do need to have respect that for the doctor's time. Doctors are really crunched for time more than ever these days. And I think that people expect to have lots of time with a doctor or a nurse practitioner, and they just don't. And so it begins there. I think that medical professionals need to have respect, though, for the patient's fears. And one way that patients might be dealing with fear and uncertainty is to do research. Patients are trying to understand what's going on. They have been dropped into a new world with new language, new vocabulary, and they're just trying to find some compass points. What I think that we need to do is we need to start to have new systems in place. We need to be able, when we make an appointment, to say, here are the questions that I, as a patient, am going to be bringing in to this appointment. I have not yet seen a way for people to signal to a doctor. This is not going to be a straightforward appointment. I have some significant questions that I want to ask. I think we need to have respect for each other. And I think that we need to warn each other that there needs to be almost a conversation ahead of the appointment as well as during the appointment.
I think there's another issue as well that you might be able to help us with, and that is the question of misinformation or even disinformation that people may find online. I think that's part of some healthcare providers' rejection of what patients might be bringing in from what they have found online. How can we avoid that disinformation or misinformation?
Thank you for bringing it up because misinformation and disinformation threatens our whole society. And therefore, we need a whole of society response to it. We need to make sure that everyone has access to fact checking tools, everyone has access to scientific information so that the networkers can make sure to only share the best information, what has been proven to be true. And doctors also need to step into their power and use their megaphones. There's a wonderful book by Dr. Geeta Nair, Dead Wrong, and she talks about how it is that clinicians can also lift up the best information. We need everyone to get in on this. And what I would say is we need to teach everyone how to fact check. This should be a course that is taught in elementary school, middle school, high school, graduate courses. Everyone needs to understand how to look at the source and date of material. And if something is emerging, like COVID, we need to also have respect for the way that science is sometimes not settled yet. And I think that the pandemic has made people feel very unsure, where they're told one thing and then 2 weeks later that turns out not to be true. I think that has eroded people's faith in science, which I think is too bad because those of us who know that that's the best of science when we're able to update it on the fly.
Exactly. That's how it works.
We just have a minute left, Susannah. How can our listeners get involved with Rebel Health for themselves and for the loved ones they care so much about?
If you face a life-changing diagnosis or even something simple that worries you very much, please know that you are not alone. There are people who would love to help you if only they knew how to find you. Become or recruit seekers, networkers, and solvers, and look for champions who can help you bring your idea to scale. Because I know there are so many great ideas out there that are going to help the American healthcare system.
Susannah Fox, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Susannah Fox, who helps people navigate health and technology. She served as Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she led an open data and innovation lab. Prior to that, she was the entrepreneur in residence at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and directed the health portfolio at the Pew Research Center's Internet Project. Her website is Susannah Fox, that's Susannah Fox.com.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements, coco-flavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health, made with proven concentrated flavanol extract. More information at cocovia.com.
Today's show is number 1387. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you can share your comments about today's interview. You can also reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider. You'll find the show on our website on Monday morning. The podcast this week has additional information on the historical background of peer-to-peer networks in healthcare and advice on finding resources and people online. We discuss the problems of misinformation and disinformation online and learn why PubMed is such an important resource. Don't miss it.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast, so you can find out ahead of time what topics we'll be covering. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.